Liberalism, in sum, has promoted liberation but delivered loneliness. It has advocated for economic leveling but produced stagnation. It's argued for fairness but delivered mediocrity. And it's promoted tolerance but has delivered intellectual totalitarianism. But alas, there's good news. The French Revolution failed too.
Welcome back to the Kevin Roberts Show. It's a special episode as we're going to be walking through Dr. Roberts' opening remarks at a debate that was held at Yale. The proposition before the room, resolved. Liberalism has failed. Well, Dr. Roberts, you must have been like a dog with a bone with that one. And you gave the opening remarks, right?
Yeah, in fact, when I saw the resolution, I asked my staff, I said, well, where do I start? I mean, there's so much to say. So I tried to limit myself to the 12 failures of liberalism.
All right. So you opened in the case in favor of the resolution, obviously, but you argued first that you needed to define terms because modern liberalism is not what many people, the people who went to Yale 150 years ago, would have recognized as liberalism, right?
Yeah, that's right. I wanted to be sure that the resolution, which was intended to be a focus on the modern American left, actually had that focus, or the debate did, because what you're getting at is that even the modern conservative movement, or one part of the modern conservative movement, comes out of this classical liberal tradition, this tradition of Enlightenment philosophy that focuses on limited government, that focuses on freedom as the operative word. And I did not want to let the radical American left co-opt that tradition and somehow make it easier for them to defend it. And so we made that distinction, which was a good distinction, because the thrust of my argument was that if you take political liberalism, left of center ideology in this country, say in the 1940s and 1950s, that's the origins of this modern radical American left. But even those origins, that particular era, I would say all the way until the 1970s, it was not nearly as radical as what we confront today. In fact, I even used the example of my hero of the American left, Daniel Patrick Moynihan, who I'm convinced would be someone who'd be very happy to have a conversation with you and me because of his intellectual honesty. I'm convinced that he wouldn't be defining boys as girls and girls as boys. In other words, I think the disagreement would have been on the size and scope of government. That used to be the difference between American conservatives and American liberals. But the point I was trying to make is that modern American liberalism has become ideologically tantamount to the Jacobins of the French Revolution. And I told the students that I'm really not trying to use hyperbole in saying that, but it is true. These people are intellectual totalitarians who, if they had their druthers, wouldn't even allow heritage to exist or you and I to have this conversation.
Well, listen, your remarks about Daniel Patrick Moynihan stuck out to me. In fact, I wanted to focus on that clip. So let's watch it together, and then I got to ask you.
Today's liberalism is not at all the thoughtful, albeit only partially correct, political program of Daniel Patrick Moynihan, for example. In that great statesman's place now stand leaders who, by any objective measure, are far more radical. So much so, one struggles to see the ideological continuity between them and Moynihan, to say nothing of some of their explicit rejection of that too moderate liberal past.
Well, you're right. I mean, we would have gotten along and agreed on a lot of things. If I remember right, he recognized the threat of communism pretty starkly back during the Cold War, right? I mean, he
completely. And he wasn't alone as a liberal Democrat in doing so. He was very strong on national security, as most Democrats were. He was also prescient in his understanding of how increased government involvement in the New Deal and in the Great Society would undermine families, in particular African-American families.
That's
in fact, my own academic scholarship was inspired by Moynihan's 1965 report on the Black family. All of that to say, I lamented, and very genuinely, I wanted the liberal students in that audience who were thoughtful to give this some thought. I lamented that we can't at Heritage find someone like Moynihan, someone on the left who we know at the end of the day we're going to disagree with, that person's going to vote differently than how Heritage would recommend they do, but that we could actually sit down on the stage at Heritage and have a conversation that not only was thoughtful and not only civil, but really advance the debate, the understanding of a particular issue. But the reason we can't do that is not because we've changed, but because the left has changed. The left has become radical.
So and we're going to show more clips and progress through this, but this is such an important point, and you framed the entire remarks, Kevin, based on this. So I got to ask you, what changed? There's no doubt that the American left has changed from Daniel Patrick Moynihan, but what did it? What happened? What did we miss?
What changed was with each generation of leftist professors, but I repeat myself, from the 1920s to the 1940s to the 1960s to the 1980s to the early 2000s, each of them became more radical. And the real intellectual origins for the radical American left go all the way back to William James, infamous philosopher, late 1800s, where basically there is a focus on humans as sort of a cog in the machine. It's a little related to Marxism, but it's not full-fledged Marxism. All of that to say that by the 1970s, say for example with the Roe versus Wade decision, the modern American left became more associated with attacks on the dignity of the human person. We saw that obviously with access to abortion. We saw that with the attack on traditional values in the 1990s, and then traditional marriage, which persists to this day. And now, of course, in sort of an absurdity of this ideology, modern American liberals have pushed onto the Supreme Court someone who can't even say she can define a woman. That ought to strike us as the sort of death throes intellectually of this movement. But it also historically, to me, is very similar to the intellectual history of the Jacobins and the French Revolution, who basically had a competition within themselves, within their own group, to be more radical than the next one. That's where the left is going. This is, I mean, you know that I'm an optimist, but as it relates to the ideology of the left, this is not going to end pretty for them. I hope that they're not in power when that happens. And it's that much more important for us on the right to really build a majority coalition politically. But that's the concern that I have, is that there is not really any longer much hope that the left is going to be governed by reasonable people like Moynihan.
All right, let's move on to more of your remarks there at Yale during this debate. You now took up the argument about our society, moral order, and you said that a healthy society requires what Russell Kirk described as an enduring moral order. Let's take a look at this clip where you raise concerns about the erosion of mediating institutions like churches and civic groups and local organizations. Let's watch.
Modern liberalism denies what Russell Kirk describes as an enduring moral order. The consequences for our nation, for our fellow Americans, have been disastrous, for denying that moral order has led to a deterioration of our social order. Consider Kirk's expounding on this point. He says, this word order signifies harmony. There are two aspects for types of order: the inner order of the soul and the outer order of the commonwealth. 25 centuries ago, Kirk continues, Plato taught this doctrine, but even the educated nowadays find it difficult to understand. The modern era has experienced the hideous consequences of the collapse of belief in a moral order, like the atrocities and disasters of Greece in the 5th century before Christ. The ruin of great nations in our century shows us the pit into which fall societies that mistake clever self-interest or ingenious social controls for pleasing alternatives to an old-fangled moral order.
So in your mind, how does modern liberalism weaken this moral foundation?
Namely, by replacing religion with the state. And so they have done that through, I would say, first of all, unintentionally in the 1960s with the expansion of welfare programs. And then when we got enough data 10, 20 years later to realize that those welfare programs were disincentivizing marriage. They were basically tearing apart civil society by having government do what local organizations would have done to help other Americans, that is government replacing civil society, that was bad enough. And then fast forward to the Obama administration, which I cite not just to pick on politically, but substantively as a policy leader, to say that they explicitly assaulted religious liberty. I mean, one tiny example was the court case that the college I was leading had. Thankfully, we had these co-plaintiffs known as Little Sisters of the Poor, because the government was requiring Catholic colleges to sign on to a particular form of healthcare that we just don't accept theologically. I mean, it would be like telling an adherent of any major religion, here's one of the core teachings you must violate, you must sign this paper. The Obama administration spent tens of millions of dollars defending the government on this. This is not the sign of a rational ideology that simply wants to expand government. And so now we have the recent experience of the Biden administration, and I cited this, of having the Federal Bureau of Investigation investigate Latin mass-going Catholics. And I cite these examples because I happen to be familiar with them firsthand, but there's a litany of other examples of the modern American left wanting religious freedom, religious organizations to get out of the way. But let me also say that they've also wanted to eliminate even non-religious providers. During the first Trump term, one of the policies that I and my colleagues at the Texas Public Policy Foundation worked on, Heritage was working on this too, was trying to develop a system, a center-right approach to ending homelessness, or at least mitigating homelessness. And so there were some really promising local providers who were doing that, who weren't even providers of faith. These are just civil society organizations. The Obama administration had prevented them from providing those services. Why? Because they want government to have a one-to-one relationship with every American. That's a real problem.
Yeah, and not only had those policies eroded religious and civic organizations that used to be such a major structure of our society, but even the most basic unit of our society, the family, has been eroded by this. You mentioned welfare programs sort of disincentivizing getting married before you have children, or at all when you have children. And then you also pointed to a poll. Let's take a look at this, because I found this astounding.
Because it is the family, as you know all too well, that is the basis of society. But let me offer you a statistic from a recent public opinion survey. Consider from that survey that 85% of self-described liberal Democrats disagree with the following statement: society is better off if people make marriage and having children a priority. 85% of self-identified liberal Democrats disagree with that. There's not in that statement a suggestion that you can't go to college, you can't go to Yale, you can't pursue other things you're interested in. It's a simple statement. It's been true throughout society. It's an astonishing and telling statistic about what the most ardent liberals truly believe. And they do so in spite of scores of academic studies by people on the left and people on the right that show by every measure, whether financial security, educational attainment, or just simple happiness, that being married and having children, if possible, correlates strongly to those positive outcomes. Through their policies, such as disincentivizing marriage and welfare programs, started in 1965 with the grossly misnamed War on Poverty, to using media to undermine popular support for the ideal, modern liberalism has disproportionately contributed to our demographic disaster in waiting. I'm not being hyperbolic when I say that with a fertility rate of 1.59, the United States faces a death spiral. Who will pay? Who will pay? Who will pay for all of those social programs that have been created since the 1960s? For that matter, how much more prosperity might we all possess today had modern leftists not succeeded in pushing to legalize abortion? The absence of 63 million Americans aborted since 1973 has had gargantuan consequences on the sustainability of the very welfare state created by the left.
That was astounding, that my neighbor, who might vote differently than me, actually doesn't agree that prioritizing marriage and children should be a focus for Americans. How did we get so different, and why is that important in terms of the failure of liberalism?
Well, we got that different because of decades of miseducation, as we've talked about, and the reason it's so troublesome for us is that it's therefore difficult to build a bipartisan coalition to address family policy, something that Heritage has started working on. It's difficult to build a bipartisan coalition to say have safety net reforms, which you used to be able to do. We did that in the early 1970s under Nixon. We did that in the 1990s under Clinton. And the reason I say bipartisan is not because that's a goal that I wake up wanting every day, although it's nice when it can happen, but is because in this very politically polarized society, I think we're going to be in a long era of a very narrow majorities, Republican or Democrat in Congress. And so it would be nice if you're tackling these civilizational questions, the future of the family, the future of human dignity, so that safety net reforms don't create a dependency state, or safety net programs don't create dependency. It'd be nice to have both parties support that, but it's impossible now.
So if I'm a liberal and I'm saying, yeah, don't prioritize marriage, don't prioritize children, don't prioritize families, and then the next thing you know, our fertility rate is down to like what, 1.59%, I think you said in your remarks. Just pure facts, pure math, Dr. Roberts. If I'm a liberal and I love all of these big, expensive programs, if we're not having babies and we're not prioritizing families to make babies, who's going to pay for all this?
Those of us who are producers, those of us who sign the front side of a paycheck, and that's going to be amplified, according to the left, by immigrating tens of millions of immigrants, however which way. And whatever one may think about what the appropriate level of immigration is, there are differences of opinion on the right. We ought not look at immigrants themselves as cogs in the machine. We're actually undermining the dignity of them as human persons by saying they're going to be some mathematical solution to our own deficiencies as a society. It's disgusting. It's grotesque. And so it's really important that those of us on the right who believe fervently, for example, in limited government and economic freedom, also understand that the left's issue is a mathematics problem. They simply can't do math. And I'm not trying to be ugly by saying that. If they could do math, they would know that system simply won't work, because American society will, to put it mildly, look a lot differently in 2050 than it did 10 years ago.
And just because I know family is such an important part of what you do and why you do what you do, and all of us at Heritage, how does the health of the family, in your mind, affect the long-term stability of a country, regardless of the economic reality we just discussed?
I don't mean to be simple in saying this, but you simply can't have a nation. You cannot have a nation without healthy families. There has never been an example I can think of in human history in which a nation state has persisted after the deterioration of families. The typical cause for the deterioration of families is a war of long duration. And you end up having too few men, because they were killed in war or maimed in war, to be able to have families literally reproduce. And then the nation state gets very weak. We're doing this by our own decisions. And I mentioned the following in the debate. What if the 63 million Americans who've been aborted since 1973 were alive and participating in society, not just economically and therefore helping pay for these safety net programs, but more importantly, helping us build our communities, being teachers, heck, maybe presidents of the United States. What if we had that? Well, we've made that mistake. President Trump, praise God, has begun the process of scaling that back. But we still have a lot to fix as it relates to the family, because unless we reverse this trend of lower and lower fertility rates, lower and lower birth rates in this country, we're going to have to rely on either higher taxation or immigrants to keep the system going. But even if we do that, if we're not building families one generation after the next, the nation state of America as we know it within 50 years is going to be very, very different. And then by that, I mean worse. Now, I happen to think we're going to fix it all, but that's the pessimistic diagnosis if we stay on this path.
Well, and that was, I think, useful for the argument you were making here, where you were trying to prove that liberalism has failed. So it's important to focus on it. So I liked this part of the speech. Let's take a quick look at it because, I mean, there's that old trope that conservatives measure a big government welfare program by how many people we can get off of that program who don't need it anymore. Liberals measure the success based on how many people are dependent on it. And you talked about the dependence on the welfare state. Let's take a look.
Modern liberalism has created a dependency state, which has failed Americans by undermining the dignity of the human person. There is a long tradition in the West, and in particular in the Christian intellectual tradition, that the purpose of work is not merely or exclusively material acquisition. It's a fulfillment of one's gifts and participation in the broader civic life. I anticipated that there would be broad agreement on that, so thank you for fulfilling that expectation. In other words, friends on the left, friends in the center, friends on the right understand that, maybe to varying degrees. And it was none other than the late Pope Francis, not known as a political conservative, who observed, "There is no poverty worse than that which takes away work and the dignity of work." But that's precisely what so much of our welfare programs have done since 1965. Setting aside the commitment that conservatives, at Heritage we're conservatives, not libertarians, conservatives have in helping the disabled, people who need temporary assistance. We have as strong as a commitment to that as our friends on the left. Setting that legitimate usage of those funds aside, consider, for example, that 1 in 5 Americans, about 75 million Americans, are on Medicaid. Do we really believe that there are 75 million Americans who fall into one of those categories? No, absolutely not. This has created the mindset that the state is the answer. But you see, that's precisely been the objective of many people on the left for the last several decades.
So this was critically important, I think, to measure the success of liberalism here because, again, they focus on so many things just through an economic lens. But you really spent some time talking about the dignity of work and that this isn't just about paying for somebody's house or paying for somebody's meals because then they lose their own personal dignity. Am I understanding your remarks properly?
That's right. Sometimes we conservatives make the wrong argument first. It's a valid critique of the welfare system, which is that it's too expensive. And that then leads to the critique by the left that we just want to get people off the rolls. We ought to invert that. We started doing that at Heritage recently and saying, no, the reason we want safety net program reform, welfare reform, is because of the dignity of our fellow Americans being violated by the creation of dependency. We wouldn't, if from the political left to the political right, if we encounter a family member or a friend who is suffering from some kind of chemical dependency or emotional dependency, we would want to take action as an individual to help them with that. My argument is we've done the same thing at scale in the United States because just take Medicaid as an example. I would create Medicaid a little bit differently than it was. It's created. Let's say you want Medicaid to persist, to be sustained. For the people, the indigent, the disabled who really need it, the people who need it temporarily, moms with kids in particular, totally fine with us at Heritage. We're conservatives, not libertarians. What we've done is make Medicaid unstable because the left has decided that it is a political tool. If you expand this, you create dependence on you, the Democratic Party. What we're saying at Heritage is, let's get back to basics and scale back these safety net programs so that they actually can provide the services that our fellow Americans need. And the reality is, it's a much smaller number of fellow Americans who need these services. It's not only going to save money, but more importantly, the dignity of work is where we get so much of our self-worth. It's where we understand our own contributions to civil society. We have to get back to that in America in order to reverse all of these trends.
Yeah, I think what I'm hearing you say is that if we argue that these big government welfare programs are just too expensive, we've kind of lost the argument because they're always going to find the money. They'll figure out a way to pay for them. It's not about the cost of the programs. It's about the actual, what it's taking from us as Americans, as human beings and our dignity to have to now suddenly not just get a helping hand, but to actually become dependent on all of those programs. Our children will then be dependent on those programs instead of dependent on us like they're supposed to be.
That's exactly right. And one bit of good news here.
See, I learned something from you, Professor.
Oh, man, you can be a professor in your own right. One bit of good news, during the negotiations on the One Big Beautiful Bill, members of Congress, with great help from my colleagues at Heritage, inserted great reforms on Medicaid, taking illegal aliens off the roll. Why did we win that argument? Yeah, we talked about the expense of it, but we talked about the absurdity of people who've broken the law to come here to the United States illegally and then immediately be put on the rolls of Medicaid, robbing fellow Americans of services that we've promised them, American to American. That argument won the day. Americans understood that innately. So we need to frame all of our arguments in that way.
There was also a really interesting part of your remarks at Yale here in this debate, Dr. Roberts, that I didn't see coming. I know they didn't see coming. Let's take a look at it. It had to do with community banks, of all things.
The push towards centralization, exemplified by the Education Department, has, of course, run roughshod over small businesses. Often when you're in the news cycle reading about deregulation, you think it's this knee-jerk conservative response to leftist overreach. It is a response against leftist overreach. But too much of that commentary by the left and the right comes to focus on large corporations. My point here is to look at this at the micro level from the standpoint of Main Street, not Wall Street. And if you take one industry in particular, banking, think about how difficult it is to find a community bank. The good of a community bank transcends left and right. There were 12,000 community banks in 1990. It's a place where it's easier, for the most part, to borrow money if you're starting a small business, if you are local, if you're part of that community. But instead, because of regulation pushed primarily by the left, although aided and abetted by a couple of wrong-headed people on the right, community banks have been destroyed. There are 4,000 today. There have been, just in the last 4 or 5 years, only 20 or 25 that have been newly chartered. I use that as an example of this problem of overregulation, which is a pet project of the left.
Yeah, I don't know where you came up with this one, but I swear they weren't ready for it. And I had never really thought about this issue. What is this loss of community banks? Back in 1990, how many were there? Like 12,000, I think I made a note of.
Yeah, we have 1/3 the number of community banks today than we did 30 years ago.
So in other words, so this has to do with centralization of capital, which is sort of a liberal ideal, right?
Yeah, I happen to care very deeply about community banks, not because I have any financial interest in any of them other than being a very dedicated customer of community banks for decades, but because I think that small is beautiful. I think, I'm a conservative. We're conservatives at Heritage because we want small businesses to flourish. And there is the classic example of the terrible impact of big business getting in bed with big government has been the destruction of 2/3 of this country's community banks in the last 30 years. Why are community banks important? Because if you're a small business or you want to be a small business, getting access to credit through the community bank is easier than it is through the big banks. Why is that? Because they know you. They see you at the Rotary Club meeting. They can go down and knock on the door of your business and see how you're doing. The community banks, speaking historically, I'm going all the way back to the 1780s. They have been essential parts of America's economic growth, but also the sort of social and community fiber, or fabric rather. Well, that's an important argument, but I also wanted to throw a curveball to the left, who probably expected me as the president of the Heritage Foundation to come in and talk about GDP and economic growth and all these things. And those things are fine and important, but I'm not going to lead with that. I really want to look at the health of American communities. And the argument I was trying to make is because at Heritage we're conservatives, we care about the permanent things, we look at policy through the lens of everyday Americans. What example, what industry could I use to tell this story? And it was so fun to see the looks on the students' faces asking themselves, why is this guy talking about community banks?
I knew it. I knew you threw it for a loop. Well, listen, if I wasn't prepared for the argument, I'm sure they weren't. All right, before we get to your closing remarks, I just heard you mention 1780. Oh, really? Well, we are celebrating our 250th anniversary here in America. We always like to shoot these things through the lens of 250. But the problem is liberalism and conservatism, it meant something very different back then, as we've already discussed. So instead, I'd rather talk about this high-minded intellectual debate forum that you participated in at Yale. How important were rigorous and intellectual debates to our founders? Obviously, they debated there in Independence Hall over the nuances of our Declaration of Independence, but this was kind of a normal thing, a part of their life, wasn't it? Whether it was in Congress or whether it was at the pub.
No, completely. It's a rhetoric that we have lost some. I don't think we've lost it entirely. In fact, I applauded very genuinely every member of the Yale Political Union, which is about a century old, from the left to the right. They all acquitted themselves well in terms of the rhetorical style. Obviously, I was on one side of the resolution. I disagreed with some of the substance, but it's really important, as I started with at the debate, for them to continue to exemplify this civil discourse, not just because it's how we ought to have these policy conversations, but because it is literally part of our political tradition in the United States. And that political tradition of formal and informal, well-reasoned civil debate, of course, is something that we draw almost exclusively from our British forebears. Even if Americans are from different societies, that tradition comes from them. And I just think it's really important that we not only continue this, but actually expand it. And so in that spirit, the very next day, I went and did the podcast of Professor David Blight, who last year in a rather hot piece he wrote in the New Republic about heritage and about me wanting to destroy the history profession, challenged me to a series of public debates. We weren't able to get those scheduled yet, but I went on his podcast. We had a very civil discussion in which we disagreed on just about everything. But what we wanted to show is that you can have that conversation without using profanity, without getting angry, developing a friendship, which I can say I've developed with the professor. I'm not sure we agree on much beyond, maybe baseball and a couple of policy issues. Having debate actually ought to instill in us an even greater confidence in our respective positions. It's not a way of saying you're having a debate to go compromise with the other side. That may happen, and maybe in some cases that's right. We're actually building civil society by having these conversations. And frankly, as I told the students, including the most liberal socialist in that crowd, I was really proud of them, and I encourage them to keep doing what they're doing.
Well, that's great. And, disagreeing without being disagreeable is sort of one of the founding principles of this country as we celebrate America's 250th. And only rarely did those disputes end in a duel.
Only rarely.
Very rarely. Oh. Yeah. And when it did, it made a great Broadway musical. All right. So your closing argument was very practical. I loved how you closed things out. You basically, you pointed at the scoreboard. Here, let's take a look.
In closing, let me observe that while I am honored to be here, and I truly am, at least before your speeches, just kidding. I look forward to them. And I enthusiastically believe that liberalism has failed. You ultimately should value the actions of other Americans over my own words. Millions of our fellow Americans have voted on this resolution with their own feet. That's right. In our nation's bluest of blue states, residents are fleeing in droves. Their liberal regimes of high taxation, high crime, poor education, and indoctrination are oppressive and intolerable. As a result, just since 2020, 3.7 million people have fled the liberal bastions of California, New York, New Jersey, Massachusetts, and Illinois. In New York, since 2020, 1.1 million, 5.5% of the state's population have relocated. The good news, besides the boon in business for one-way U-Haul rentals to red states, is that if the trend continues, red states will expand their electoral college majority, hopefully accelerating the recent progress we have made against these failed leftist policies. Liberalism, in sum, has promoted liberation but delivered loneliness. It has advocated for economic leveling, but produced stagnation. It's argued for fairness, but delivered mediocrity. And it's promoted tolerance, but has delivered intellectual totalitarianism. But alas, there's good news. The French Revolution failed too.
Thank you.
Yeah, so you say Americans are already deciding this. They're voting with your feet. The great migration from liberal states. That's, I mean, you can't debate that, even though they tried.
No, I told them, don't listen to me. Listen to your fellow Americans. They're telling you what's happening. And in fact, that's going to expand so much that I think if the political right can weather the midterms and the 2028 presidential election, that our side, if we continue to do conservative things, conservative policies, has the potential to be a governing coalition for a very long time.
Well, first it was Cambridge last month, and now it's Yale. Thank you for engaging in these debates in such a friendly and powerful way on behalf of the conservative movement. This is why we need you on that wall, Kevin Roberts. We want you on that wall.
Well, it's actually a privilege, and I miss the classroom. I get a taste of that by teaching our intern classes several times at Heritage. But as I told the Yale students, I look forward to being back.
Well, I want you to watch the video, everybody, out there for yourself. Take a look at the entirety of Dr. Roberts' remarks there at Yale. We've only given you a sampling here, and we'd love to get your comments on it here. And I'd love your judgment, too. Do you agree with the premise that liberalism in America has now failed? And Dr. Roberts ended that speech by challenging everyone in the audience to just judge liberalism by its own results. They kind of speak for themselves. So make that judgment. Let us know your comments down below, and we look forward to seeing you next time right here on The Kevin Roberts Show.